Every alarm in the Avengers compound is screaming at once, and the screens on the war room walls are showing the same image from 17 different satellite angles. A city in South Korea being swallowed from the ground up, buildings folding inward like paper, the streets cracking open into something that has no name in any language that existed before tonight. Friday is running threat assessments and returning the same result on every calculation. Unknown, unknown, unknown. And then, through the smoke and the collapse and the dark, something moves that is not running away. This video is not a hype video. This is the story of what happens when the world's most powerful team of heroes encounters a man who already died once, came back as something the universe did not have a classification for, and has been quietly carrying an army of shadows ever since. Subscribe and hit the bell right now, because this one goes places that most crossover videos are afraid to go, and you do not want to miss a single part of it.
The gate opened at 3:47 in the morning, Seoul time, and it opened differently from every gate that had come before it. Not the familiar shimmering vertical tear that the Hunter Association had been cataloging and responding to for years, but a horizontal rupture, flat against the ground, spreading outward from a single point in the financial district like a crack in ice, silent and fast and absolute. What came through it was not a standard horde. The creatures that emerged from that gate were the kind that appeared at the top of S-rank classifications, the kind that had historically required a coordinated response from multiple high-level hunters and still produced casualties. And they came in numbers that the response teams on the ground stopped counting after the first 2 minutes because the count had ceased to be useful information. The Avengers were wheels up from the New York compound 14 minutes after the first satellite alert, and Tony Stark spent those 14 minutes in the air running analyses on the gate signature that kept returning data his systems flagged as corrupted, because the energy readings from that rupture did not match any dungeon gate ever recorded, did not match any known energy signature on Earth, and kept overlapping in the modeling software with readings from the Infinity Stones in ways that made his stomach do something unpleasant that he chose not to examine too closely. Steve Rogers stood in the cargo bay with his arms crossed and watched the feeds from Seoul with the expression he got when the situation was bad enough that optimism would be an insult to the reality of it, and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say yet. They were 40 seconds from visual range when the screaming on the ground feeds stopped. Not because the communication lines went down. The lines were fine, the feeds were active, the cameras were recording. The screaming stopped because whatever had been happening on those streets had stopped happening, replaced by a silence so sudden and so complete that the analysts back at the compound initially assumed a technical failure and spent 6 seconds checking their equipment before accepting that the silence was real. Sung Jin-Woo was standing in the middle of the financial district when the Quinjet broke through the cloud cover, and the scene around him was the kind of thing that redefines the word aftermath. Every creature from that gate was down, not retreating, not regrouping, down in the specific permanent way that left no ambiguity about their status. He was not breathing hard. His armor, black and articulated and carrying a quality of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it rather than simply being dark in color, showed no damage. He was holding one of his weapons loosely at his side, the blade trailing a faint shadow that moved slightly against the direction of the wind, and he was looking up at the Quinjet with an expression that was not hostile and not welcoming and not particularly anything. The expression of a man who has already assessed the situation and is simply waiting for the next relevant piece of information to arrive. Tony's sensors swept him and came back with a readout that caused him to say something sharp and profane under his breath, because the power signature this man was producing was not a clean single reading, but a layered one, dozens of distinct energy sources operating simultaneously, and the largest of them was coming from somewhere below the surface, something vast and dark and patient that was connected to him the way a shadow is connected to the thing that casts it. It was not threatening in its posture. That was somehow the most unsettling part. Not that it felt dangerous, but that it felt completely unhurried. The energy of something that has never once in its existence needed to rush, because rushing implies uncertainty about the outcome. Steve Rogers opened the cargo bay door and looked down at the man standing alone in the wreckage of a fight that should have taken a full response team, and quietly said, "Who is that?" Nobody answered, because nobody had an answer that felt adequate to what they were looking at.
The debrief happened in a glass-walled conference room at the temporary SHIELD forward base 3 kilometers from the gate site, and it was the kind of meeting where the silences said more than the words did. Jin-Woo sat on one side of the table with his hands folded in front of him and answered every question put to him in the specific way of someone who has long since stopped needing to justify themselves to anyone, but is choosing, out of something that might have been patience or might have been curiosity, to engage with the process anyway. He explained the gate, he explained the system, the way dungeons worked, the way hunters were ranked, the way he specifically operated, and he explained it without embellishment, without any of the weight that the information deserved, the way a person describes the weather in a city they have lived in so long it no longer registers as remarkable. Tony listened with the focused stillness he reserved for things that genuinely troubled him, the kind of listening that looked from the outside like skepticism, but was actually the opposite, was actually the intensity of a mind that had encountered something it could not immediately file anywhere and was refusing to pretend otherwise. He asked about the energy signature. Jin-Woo looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes that carried a quality of depth that was not metaphorical, not the poetic kind of depth that people described in faces they found interesting, but something literally present, something that made the air around him feel slightly different in a way that was difficult to articulate and impossible to dismiss. He said, "That is my army." Tony asked how large. Jin-Woo said he had not counted recently. The silence that followed that answer lasted 4 full seconds, which in a room full of people who processed information quickly was a very long time. Steve was the one who asked the question that mattered, the one that cut through the technical discussion and landed on the human center of it. He asked Jin-Woo why he was still here, in Seoul, alone, handling gates of this scale without any support structure around him, without a team, without any of the infrastructure that the Avengers had spent years building, precisely because they had learned that no single person should have to carry this kind of weight by themselves. It was a genuine question, asked without any agenda behind it, and it landed on Jin-Woo in a way that the technical questions had not. You could see it in the slight change in his posture, not a flinch exactly, but the micro-adjustment of someone who has been asked something that reached past their prepared answers and touched something they had not planned to make available. He said that teams complicated things. He said it simply, without apology, and what lived underneath those 4 words was a history that the room could feel the shape of without knowing the details, the specific loneliness of a person who had become powerful enough that proximity to them became a liability for anyone they allowed to stand close, and who had made the calculation, somewhere along the way, that the loneliness was the more bearable of the 2 options. His hands on the table did not move when he said it, but his right thumb pressed very briefly against the inside of his left wrist, once, and then stopped, a motion so small and so private that it was clearly not intended for anyone else to see, the kind of thing a person does when a word they just said landed somewhere it was not supposed to land. What happened 4 hours later made the debrief irrelevant. The gate that had opened in the financial district had not closed. It had expanded, steadily and without announcement, and what was pushing through its edges now was not the S-rank creatures from before. Those had apparently been the leading edge of something, a pressure test, a first knock on a door that was now being taken entirely off its hinges.
The readings Tony was getting from the new wave made the first wave look like a warm-up act, and the warm-up act had flattened a city block before Jin-Woo had walked through it like it was a minor inconvenience on his way to somewhere more interesting. Thor looked at the readings and said very quietly that whatever was coming through that gate was not from any world he recognized. Natasha checked her weapons with the automatic efficiency of someone whose hands know what to do, even when the mind is still catching up to the size of the problem. And Jin-Woo, who had been standing at the window looking at the distant glow of the expanded gate with an expression that the rest of the room had been trying to read for the last 4 hours without success, reached up and summoned his armor from the shadow at his feet, the black plates assembling around him in absolute silence, and said, "I will go first." He did not wait for a response.
Step back for a moment, because what this story is actually about has not been said out loud yet, and it needs to be. Every person in that room had been broken by something before they became what they are now. Steve lost a whole world. Tony built walls out of iron because the alternative was admitting how afraid he was. And Jin-Woo died alone in a dungeon at 20 years old and came back carrying something that the world never gave him a manual for. What is working toward that gate is not just power, it is everyone who survived something they were not supposed to survive, moving together toward the next impossible thing.
What came through the expanded gate was a sovereign, not a monster in the way that word usually applied to things that emerged from dungeons, not a creature operating on instinct or hunger or the simple biological momentum of a predator moving toward prey, but something that had a will behind its eyes, a structured and ancient intelligence that looked out at the Seoul skyline and at the humans assembling against it with an expression that could only be described as contempt so deep that had passed through active emotion and come out the other side as something closer to boredom. It was enormous, armored in something that was not quite bone and not quite metal, and it arrived with a court behind it, lesser sovereigns, each one easily the size of a building, arranged in a formation that communicated military intention as clearly as any human army ever had. The ground cracked under their collective weight. The temperature dropped 11 degrees in 90 seconds, and the gate behind them sealed, permanently, with a sound like the earth clearing its throat. Thor hit the largest one first, because Thor's relationship with problems of this scale was to locate the biggest component and introduce himself to it immediately. And the lightning he brought down was the real kind, the kind that came from something deeper than technology, the kind that split the sky from top to bottom and turned the air briefly into a solid wall of white that bleached every shadow off every surface within 400 meters. It staggered the sovereign. It did not drop it. The thing turned toward Thor with the slow deliberateness of something that has decided to stop ignoring a noise and deal with it, and the blow it returned sent Thor through 2 buildings and into a third, and the sound of that impact echoed off the Han River and came back changed, flattened, wrong. Tony was running 18 simultaneous attack protocols and hitting hard, the repulsors leaving scorched craters across the Sovereign's armor that healed, visibly and quickly, the damaged surface knitting back together with a wet organic sound that his audio sensors captured and that he immediately wished they had not. Steve was coordinating the ground response with the focused precision of someone who had accepted the parameters of an impossible situation and was operating within them anyway, directing fire and movement and keeping people alive with the specific competence of a man who had made the decision a very long time ago that survival was always worth organizing for, even when the odds made organizing feel like a gesture. Jin-Woo had not moved yet. He was standing 40 meters behind the front line with his weapons sheathed and his eyes closed, and the shadow beneath him was spreading, slowly, in every direction, moving against the light in a way that shadows do not move, climbing the rubble and the broken concrete and the overturned vehicles with the unhurried patience of something that has all the time that exists and knows it. When he opened his eyes, they were not dark anymore. They were the pale, luminous silver that they became when the full depth of what he was came to the surface, and the army he had not summoned yet, the one that Tony's sensors had detected as a vast, patient darkness below everything, began to rise. They came up through the shadows like they had always been there, waiting for permission, soldiers and knights and monarchs of the dead, an army assembled across years of impossible dungeons and impossible victories, and at their head the ones who had been with him longest, the ones who carried his history in their silent, loyal forms. The ground shook with their emergence, a deep, rhythmic tremor that the sovereign and its court felt, and for the first time since arriving, registered as information worth paying attention to. One of the lesser sovereigns took a step backward, just one step, and just one of them, but in the logic of this kind of confrontation, that single step backward was a sentence, and the sentence said, "We did not know what we were walking into." Jin-Woo raised one hand, and the full weight of the Shadow Monarch's authority pressed down on the battlefield like a physical thing, like a change in air pressure, like the specific feeling of standing at the edge of something vast and looking down and understanding, finally and completely, how deep it goes. Tony's sensors went briefly haywire, not from damage but from overload, every reading spiking simultaneously as the scale of what Jin-Woo was deploying passed through the upper boundary of what his instruments were calibrated to measure. Steve stopped issuing commands for 3 full seconds, which was the longest Steve Rogers had ever been silent in the middle of a fight. The Sovereign looked at Jin-Woo. Jin-Woo looked back at it. And somewhere in that exchange, in the space between two beings who each understood authority in the way that only those who had seized it from something that tried to destroy them could understand it, something was communicated that had no translation into any human language, but that every person on that battlefield felt in their chest, a cold and clarifying recognition that the shape of this fight had just changed completely and irrevocably, and that whatever came next was no longer a battle in any conventional sense of the word. It was a reckoning, and it was only just beginning.